Hello, this is the European History Lecture for Friday, 25th September 2020. This will be concluding our overview of ancient and medieval history in preparation for moving on next week. We start out with the Hundred Years' War, a struggle where England and France are fighting over who will control France. The French king is in an unenviable position. He actually is not the strongest nobleman in his country. At various times in the High Middle Ages and Late Middle Ages, the French king is eclipsed in power by the Duke of Normandy, who also happens to be the King of England at times, dominating the West, including Aquitaine, which is along the Biscay coast. And at other times in the East, the Duke of Burgundy also threatens to challenge his domination. The Hundred Years' War is really the last attempt that the kings of England / dukes of Normandy try to take over and become kings of France. Now, whether if they had succeeded, France and England would have become Fringland or Yance, I don't know. Maybe they would have been like many monarchs who rule two distinct separate countries. But here's what happened. Again and again, the English strike out from their holdings in France to try to dominate the French. The French fight back, and at times they try to eliminate the English holdings in France. So there are a couple of important events during the Hundred Years' War. First off, it's not 100 years. It's more than that. Second off, it's not entirely fighting without any reprieve. There are times of peace during the Hundred Years' War. During the Hundred Years' War, the armored knight, which had been the chief battle soldier of the Middle Ages, met his match. Knights armored in increasingly effective plate armor, like a lobster's or a shrimp's shell, became unstoppable in warfare until the Hundred Years' War at the Battle of Crécy. The French knights faced the English army, which included Welsh longbowmen, guys from Wales who specialized in the longbow, a massively powerful weapon, more powerful than a typical bow. To learn how to properly use this weapon requires pretty much daily practice for your entire life growing up. And the skeletons of longbowmen that we've exhumed indicates that their bone structure actually morphs as a result of this work. If you want a sense, consider Tolkien's elves in The Lord of the Rings and Legolas's ability to use bows without the magical elements, and certainly without the surfing. The idea is that armored knights are protected against most forms of attack, but the amount of force in that pinpoint arrowhead that strikes one spot in the armor overwhelms the armor, causes a piercing that can wound or kill or induce at least enough shock so that the knight is out of battle. The Battle of Crécy, the French army of knights is stopped by bowmen. Now, there are other key battles, and times go on. King Henry V, in the early 1400s, around 1415, decides that what he's going to do is he is going to really try to get this thing done and win it for England. And at the Battle of Agincourt, which is the site of the battle where Shakespeare puts into his mouth the "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers" speech, which I would show if it wasn't for YouTube. Hello, YouTube. What we have is the English army mauled by the French knights, but ultimately destroying them. So Henry V at Agincourt basically wins a decisive battle, gets a hold of the King of France, marries the King of France's daughter, and appears to win the Hundred Years' War for England. But he then dies young of what seem to be natural causes, and everything's up for grabs again. The English and the French continue fighting it out. But the English still seem to have the edge until a teenage waif of a girl appears out of the peasantry, saying that the Virgin Mary spoke to her in nomine Deus, in the name of God. This girl, Joan, is compelling enough so that the French, when they hear her, make a suit of armor special for her, put her on a horse, and send her at the head of a detachment to relieve the siege of Orleans, which she does. Now the French are buoyed up by what seems to be a message from who will become Saint Joan of Arc that God is on the side of the French in this battle. The French gain massive strength from this in terms of morale. Ultimately, Joan is captured by the English and burned at the stake as a witch. They do not accept that she is a messenger of God. They think that she is delusional and also really not helpful to their attempts to win the war. But after Joan of Arc, the French win. The English are kicked out of France. The Hundred Years' War is over. And by the mid-1400s, the English have other fish to fry anyway. The Wars of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, which is spoofed a bit by George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, where House Lannister, not Lancaster, and House Stark, not York, fight one another for control of a land. Also, the British are now going to focus on the control of the English are going to focus on control of Scotland and Ireland and outward into an overseas empire, which is ultimately going to make the Victorian British Empire the dominant empire in the world at that time. Now we move to the military technology as it changes. I've told you that the knight had been the queen of battle until the longbowman comes along. In Central Europe, there's another type of soldier that stands against the knights successfully, and that is the Swiss pikemen. These pikemen carry a pike about the size of one of Alexander the Great's lances, about 14 feet long, but it's a thick piece of wood, almost a little tree trunk. And what you do is you put the heel of the pike in the ground. You put your foot on it with your full body weight, and you just sort of guide the pike. And what you end up with is a hedgerow of pikes so long that as horsemen attack, they're going to be impaled. All you have to do is guide the pike into an oncoming horseman, and they're going to do all the work. So the pikemen, as long as they hold their discipline, are able to defeat armored knights as the bowmen in the West are. But bowmen take a lifetime to train, so eventually crossbowmen replace bowmen. A crossbow is something that looks like a rifle, but it shoots a metal bolt with often a metal bowstring. And it's point and click. It's like learning to shoot a gun. It's much, much easier than learning to do the offset shooting that a good archer needs to have. But we ain't even touched the real revolution. In the East, the Chinese developed gunpowder, a mixture of saltpeter and other things, coal dust, and something else, which I should know. I'm sorry. There it goes. Anyway, gunpowder. And the Chinese, being an empire of Confucians that value ceremony, use gunpowder primarily as a ceremonial firework. But as the Mongols come west, they begin turning firework rockets into a primitive form of military rockets, and the Europeans are on the receiving ends of those at, for example, the Battle of Seja River, where the Mongols attack the Hungarians. So the Europeans get a hold of this gunpowder. And being Europeans, being in a much more intense struggle for survival with the other countries around them, the Europeans quickly learn that the best use of gunpowder, at least at that stage, is to put it at the back of a metal tube, a small one or a big one, that you put then something big and heavy in on top of it, and then you light the gunpowder on fire. And when it explodes, the laws of thermodynamics say it's going to follow the path of least resistance, and it will shove that heavy thing out at such a speed it's invisible. You can't see it. You just see the effects. So if you have a small thing, a harquebus, which is a primitive firearm, later flintlock muskets, later rifles, you discharge the explosion, and the musket ball or bullet is shot downrange, and it'll go through any armor at the time. And again, much more hit power, kinetic power, and much more chance of inducing shock and or death. So gunpowder weapons begin to become more common. And a big one is called a carronade or a cannon, and that can destroy any medieval castle. Medieval castle fortifications are completely vulnerable to gunpowder. So soon there's a new type of troop on the battlefield. Now, gunpowder weapons can be easily defeated by dampness, by rain. They take a long time to reload. Carrying gunpowder is dangerous because what if it catches on fire anyway? So at first, gunpowder troops are highly skilled, specialized kinds of troops. Just like bowmen, just like archers, crossbowmen, just like pikemen, just like armored knights. And what we're going to see in the Renaissance is that artillery cannon users and gunners, harquebus users, are only 2 parts of a 5 or a 6-part army, and you need all of those parts to win a battle. We'll come to that when we do Renaissance. This is a time of burgeoning invention, and the development of guns is just one example. There's also the magnetic compass, which comes out of China, and there are other inventions that we'll talk more about during the Age of Discovery. But these inventive ideas are beginning to pop in the 1300s and 1400s. After the Black Death, there are many fewer people. And there is about the same amount of property. And there is much labor shortage because a lot of people, especially skilled people, are dead. Before the Black Death, the whip hand was in the upper class, the nobles, because they could always get more peasants, serfs, or slaves. But after the Black Death, first of all, you've got a smaller number of people among whom to divide the same basic amount of property. So there's going to be a mathematical tendency, at least, towards the expansion of property in the hands of everyone. Doesn't quite work that way, but it works in that direction. But the real change is if a peasant, a serf, or a slave doesn't feel well treated or appreciated, he'll leave. And given the chaos in the countryside after the Black Death, he might get away with leaving and going somewhere where he's going to be better treated, better rewarded for his efforts. So the labor of the peasants, serfs, and slaves, and especially the labor of craftsmen, of carpenters, blacksmiths, and other skilled people, become significantly more valuable. And so after the plague, oddly enough, after this horror show, this ordeal that breaks society almost and shatters sanity, there's actually a flush time of prosperity where more liberty grows. Eventually, the aristocrats try to clamp down on this, and they sort of succeed, but it takes time. And this post-plague prosperity creates extra wealth that people are going to use. And this is going to spark a lot of the inventiveness and a lot of the things that are going to come during the Renaissance. The plague is economically necessary to the eventual Renaissance. That's sick, but it's true. One of the changes that happens in the late Middle Ages is the church changes its stance on the sin of usury. Loaning money at interest is deemed by the church around the end of the late Middle Ages to no longer be a mortal sin. So now Christians can compete with Jewish banking houses in order to loan money to people at interest. And that loaned money is going to sparkle and it's going to pop in the form of new businesses, new ventures, new exploration, new inventions, new everything. Two banking houses arise to dominate the banking world. In Italy and the Mediterranean world, it's the House of Medici. Medici means doctors, and the Medici end up becoming, at least sometimes, the rulers of the city of Florence up in Tuscany, the Etruscan area of Italy. In Northern Europe, it's the house of Jakob Fugger, the Fuggers, Fuggers. And the Fuggers are the bankers to the Holy Roman Emperors and the bankers to many people in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Low Countries, between Germany and France, and even some things in England. They are major banking houses. So a lot of the post-plague prosperity goes into banking and is extended as loans, which further sparks the economic engine. And for the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, actually, for the first time really since the Pax Romana of the 2nd century, an economic engine is building in Europe that is going to produce real change, real growth, and real prosperity. And the Renaissance period is just the first element of that, the benefits of all of that. New ideas, as I told you, are percolating. One of them is the basic scientific principle, the basic logical principle of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is, as you probably already know, the simple statement that among the various explanations for phenomena, the simplest, the most simply elegant is probably true. If you have a choice to explain the odd course of the planets, especially planetary retrogression in the sky. And one answer is this clockwork universe where the sun and the moon and the planets revolve around the Earth, but there are subdisks and subdisks and subdisks that explain all the weird motion of planets and comets and things like that. And the other explanation is the sun is the center of our system, and the Earth is one of many planets that orbit around it. Occam's razor would indicate that despite the apparent visual evidence that the sun and the moon are the same size, maybe, in fact, we are a planet. Occam's razor is one of the things that advocates of scientific notions of heliocentrism, which is that we are in a solar system rather than a universe that revolves around the Earth. It's one of the talking points that they use to argue it. Another thing that changes in terms of awakening energetic intellectualism is the vernacular literature of Dante Alighieri and of Geoffrey Chaucer, among others. Up until now, High Latin, medieval church Latin, was the universal language throughout Europe of worship, of scholarship, and of diplomacy. However, the gutter patois, the Creole dialects spoken in the street by people, had really begun to shift and drift apart. In Italy, you have a descendant of Latin that's going to become Italian, and Dante is going to write his famous Divine Comedy, Inferno about hell, Purgatorio about purgatory, Paradiso about heaven, not in Latin, but in gutter Italian. And he's going to be a real influence on the development of a distinct Italian language. Meanwhile, in Spain, in Portugal, in France, you have other descendants of Latin morphing into their own related Romance languages, but different from one another. Aqua, agua, you get it. The Latin influences on Germanic language, basically languages, distinct languages and distinct cultures are appearing in Europe. This monoculture that Rome used to have has split and has many children. The West is a region of many related cultures, just as ancient Greece was a region of many related poli or city-states, but one culture, many different groupings, one Western civilization, many different nation-states are going to develop. Medicine is beginning to advance in certain respects Arab medicine, which includes cleaning wounds and a lot of the principles that we will later take on in our medicine, is beginning to affect life in the more civilized areas of North Italy and Spain. And that idea is going to slowly spread and replace leechcraft, which we've talked about. In Asia, there is a source for the material silk, which is glorious to look at, supple to feel, cool in the summertime, warm in the wintertime, and at first only comes from China. It comes from silkworms on mulberry trees and bushes. And for the longest time, the Chinese Empire had laws saying that if you even tried to smuggle silkworms and or mulberry trees out of China, you and your family were going to be toast. Maybe literally, as they might burn you alive. So, for the longest time, the only source of global silk was China. Meanwhile, spices like saffron originate in what we now call Indonesia, the Dutch in the East Indies, and they're shipped to marketplaces in India, the subcontinent south of the Himalayas, which are then shipped to the markets of the Middle East. And in this shipping of silk and spices from east to west, everything gets more expensive, more expensive, more expensive. Maybe 10 times as expensive by the time it reaches the markets in the Middle East. During the Crusades, Western Crusader knights develop a taste for silk clothing and spiced foods. And they bring that taste back to Europe. And when they have money, they will pay hugely through the nose for silks and spices from the storied East. Now, the Muslims do something rather interesting. Yeah, they have the people bringing silks and spices in from the East to the markets of Cairo and Damascus. But they also know that Christian merchants are going to come from Venice and Genoa in Italy and from elsewhere to buy them. If Ahmed from down the street wants to buy silk or spices, the Muslim merchants will give them a fair price where they get money for being the middleman between the silk and spice shippers and the customers. However, if an infidel Christian dog shows up, then the infidel Christian dog is going to have the price jacked up, maybe 50%, maybe 100% as a Christian tax in order to still do business, but stick it to the infidel. And for the longest time, Christian merchants have no choice. They have to suck it up and deal. They have to accept this so-called Christian tax. It's not really called that, but that's what it is. And because they have no choice. The only sources of silks and spices come from the storied East. But this is going to inspire so much rage and resentment that the Europeans in Portugal and elsewhere are going to try to find ways around this bottleneck. And that's going to make a lot of history too. There are two dates for the ending of the Middle Ages. The first is 1453. This one is lesser known, especially in the United States. It is the fall of Constantinople. Eastern Empire had stood in one form or another throughout the entire Middle Ages. In the end, it's down to just one city and the neighborhood in north of Constantinople in the very southeastern Balkans. Finally, in 1453, the Turks bring up heavy cannons, batter down those amazing walls of Constantinople that have kept out invaders for over 1,000 years, and capture it. The Hagia Sophia is turned into an Islamic mosque. Constantinople becomes Istanbul. There's a little song about it, which I'd play for you if it wasn't for YouTube. And suddenly, the direct route from the Middle East to Europe is open to the Turks. The Ottoman Turks who conquer Constantinople are going to become a clear and present danger to all of Christendom very, very soon once they consolidate their gains in Constantinople. But that is one way of measuring the Middle Ages, the time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, the more famous ending of Middle Ages is when Columbus discovers America for Europe. That's in 1492, just a little while longer. So sometime in the late 1400s, Christianity or Christendom in the Middle Ages becomes early modern Europe. And we're going to talk about that. One early result of this is there are two places in Europe that benefit from a lot of the Eastern knowledge. Spain, because of the Reconquista, where Christians conquer largely intact, Islamic libraries, universities, cities, hospitals. And so Spain is going to be set to be a superpower. And the other place is northern Italy, and that has to do with geography. The Christian silk and spice merchants who travel across the Mediterranean from cities like Venice, Italy, and Genoa, Italy, and others, they are the ones that do this because Venice and Genoa are about as far as you can get up the Italian peninsula as it joins with the European mainland. And it's easier to ship by sea than by land up until we develop railroads in the 1800s. So Venice and Genoa are on the east and west coasts of Italy, just as the peninsula leaves the European mainland. So you ship them as far north by sea as you can to Venice or Genoa, and then you send people by land over the Alps out to your customers. So northern Italy is going to also be suffused with this Eastern knowledge as well as the wealth that comes from the silk and the spice trades. And that is going to be an economic reason why the Renaissance happens when it does and where it does in North Italy. What is Renaissance? I'll leave you with this last thought in my lecture. The Renaissance is the rebirth of the ancient classical knowledge into a new Christian culture. The rebirth of the ancient classical knowledge of Greece and Rome into a new Christian culture. The culture of the late Middle Ages is overwhelmingly and profoundly Christian, and the Renaissance is going to reflect this. So that's where we are. Next Monday, you've got to have read Spielvogel chapter 16, not 15. You have to do Baker Workbook chapter 16, not 15, and turn it in on Monday or Tuesday. You also have to have yourself ready for a Baker quiz on chapter 16, not 15. And finally, there's going to be a quiz early next week. It may be Monday or Tuesday also. There's a small chance it'll be Wednesday or Thursday, but I suspect it'll be Monday or Tuesday, when you're going to be quizzed on everything I've covered so far in my lectures, from creation myths up to the dawn of the Renaissance. Now, if you've paid attention to my lectures, if you followed my notes to the extent you can, even though I jumped all over the place, if you took notes yourself, that's what you should study. Because the big quiz is going to be based on my lectures. It's not designed to play gotcha. It's designed to have you show off the knowledge you've earned. And most of my quizzes are matching or multiple choice. So knowing what terms mean and what things are is kind of important. I almost never give isolated dates. I'll usually give an event and a date, like the fall of Constantinople, 1453. And I won't just put 1453. I'll give fall of Constantinople, 1453. And then you'll have to say what it means. And what it means is the end of the Byzantine Empire, or maybe the end of the Middle Ages. So after that, next week, we're going to go into the Renaissance itself. And next week seems to be the last week we're going to be doing the AB schedule. The following week, starting October 5th, we're going to have most people in the room at the same time. We'll see how that goes. Have a great weekend. Get your work done. Bye-bye.